The universe, in its infinite wisdom and cosmic sense of humor, had apparently decided that every sentient species should share one fundamental trait: an overwhelming, logic-destroying compulsion to protect the young of every other species. This wasn't some noble philosophical choice or carefully negotiated treaty. Oh no, that would have been far too sensible. Instead, it was hardwired into their very DNA, a biological imperative so powerful it made grown hegemony battlecruiser captains weep at the sight of a Zephyrian tadpole. The scientists called it the Universal Cub Protection Mandate, though most beings simply referred to it as that thing that makes me completely useless whenever something small and fuzzy shows up. The phenomenon had been discovered roughly 3 centuries ago, when the first interstellar expeditions began encountering other species' offspring. What should have been historic first contact scenarios instead devolved into ridiculous displays of cross-species babysitting, with hardened military officers abandoning their posts to ensure a tiny alien creature didn't stub its pseudopod. The effect was so universal, so absolute, that xenobiologists had initially theorized it must be some sort of psychic manipulation or evolutionary convergence. Surely, they reasoned, such a specific behavioral pattern couldn't have developed independently across thousands of different worlds. Yet extensive research had confirmed the unthinkable. Every single sapient species in known space possessed the same overwhelming protective instinct toward juveniles of other species. Every species, apparently except one. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The practical implications of this biological quirk had transformed galactic civilization into something resembling the universe's most dysfunctional daycare center. Interstellar trade routes regularly experienced delays when cargo ship crews encountered young aliens at spaceports, and simply refused to leave until they were certain the creatures were properly fed, sheltered, and tucked in for appropriate rest periods. Military conflicts had become exercises in absurdist theater, with opposing fleets calling truces the moment someone's offspring wandered onto the battlefield. The Andorian Commerce Guild had actually instituted a policy requiring all member species to declare their breeding seasons in advance, allowing shipping companies to plan routes that avoided systems during peak adorable offspring period. The policy had reduced delays by approximately 15%, though it had also led to the unfortunate side effect of several trade wars when species accused each other of deliberately timing their reproductive cycles to disrupt economic activity. Even the notorious Beltron Syndicate, a criminal organization so ruthless they'd been known to steal candy from babies, metaphorically speaking, had been forced to restructure their entire operation around the protection mandate. Their most feared enforcer, a 7-foot-tall reptilian nightmare named Gorth the Terrible, had once spent 3 days building an elaborate playground for a group of lost Flarean cubs, instead of completing his assigned intimidation job. The syndicate had eventually adapted by employing only beings whose species had already reproduced that cycle, reasoning that post-parental hormones provided some slight resistance to the effect. This cosmic comedy had been the status quo for generations. Entire academic disciplines had developed around managing protection mandate incidents. Specialized emergency response teams stood ready to extract paralyzed crews from ships where someone had accidentally brought their offspring aboard. The situation had become so normalized that most beings simply accepted it as an unchangeable fact of existence, like gravity or the inevitability of bureaucratic inefficiency, which made the humans' behavior all the more remarkable. Captain Ezra Hendricks of the independent freight hauler Bad Decision had been operating in Sector 7 for the better part of 2 years. And something about him was fundamentally wrong. Not wrong in an obvious way. He wasn't cruel to young aliens, didn't ignore their needs, and certainly didn't harm them. If anything, he seemed more competent around juveniles than most beings were around their own species' offspring. But here was the thing that had caught the attention of several very confused xenobiologists. Hendricks could actually function normally while in the presence of alien cubs. He didn't freeze up when a Deltan kit wandered into his cargo bay. He didn't abandon his shipping schedule to spend 3 days ensuring a group of Orion tadpoles had properly balanced nutrition. He would certainly help if a young alien was in genuine danger, but he did so with the same practical efficiency he applied to equipment maintenance or navigation calculations. It was, by universal standards, completely unnatural behavior. The implications were staggering, though most beings were too busy cooing over whatever adorable creature had wandered into their vicinity to properly consider them. Alexian Thornweave, the hegemony's leading xenobiological researcher, had built his career on understanding the inexplicable quirks of interspecies biology. He had published groundbreaking papers on Vorthan mating displays, decoded the emotional spectrum of crystalline Etherian offspring, and once spent 6 months living among the hive mind Nexari to understand their collective child-rearing practices. But Captain Hendricks had him completely baffled. The human was currently sitting in Thornweave's laboratory on Station Omega, calmly filling out shipping manifests, while a small Pleiadian cub, roughly the size and fluffiness of what humans apparently called a hamster, explored the various scientific instruments scattered across the workbench. Any other being in the galaxy would have been reduced to a cooing, protective puddle by now. Thornweave himself was fighting the urge to abandon his research entirely to ensure the little creature didn't accidentally ingest anything hazardous. "How are you doing?" Thornweave asked, his 6 eyes twitching, as the cub investigated a particularly delicate spectrometer. Hendricks glanced up from his paperwork. "Doing what?" "Functioning. Thinking coherently. Not turning into a mindless guardian drone." Thornweave gestured helplessly at the cub, who had now discovered that the spectrometer made interesting beeping sounds when poked. "That creature is triggering every protective instinct I possess, and I'm barely maintaining enough cognitive function to ask you questions." The human shrugged and reached over to gently redirect the cub away from the more expensive equipment, offering it a small rubber ball from his pocket instead. The movement was casual, practiced, entirely without the trembling reverence that typically accompanied interspecies cub interaction. "Maybe you're overthinking it." "Overthinking it." Thornweave's primary research partner, Dr. Naya Brightscale, had theorized that human brains might be fundamentally structured differently from other sapient species. Her preliminary scans had shown unusual neural pathway arrangements in the regions associated with protective behaviors, but nothing that should grant complete immunity to the protection mandate. Their colleague, Dr. Yannick Crossfield, had proposed that humans might represent some sort of evolutionary dead end, a species that had simply failed to develop proper protective instincts. This theory had been immediately dismissed when they observed Hendricks risk his life to rescue a group of Deltan kits from a collapsing cargo container the previous week. The human had displayed protective behavior. He simply hadn't been rendered catatonic by it. Umbria Duskwind, the station's psychological specialist, had suggested that humans might possess some form of natural mental shielding, perhaps evolved as a defense against psychic predators on their homeworld. Extended interviews with Hendricks had revealed that Earth had no known psychic fauna, ruling out that possibility as well. The mystery deepened when they brought in Dr. Bartok Ironjaw, a specialist in evolutionary biology. His theory involved humans potentially developing in an environment where protective paralysis would have been evolutionarily disadvantaged. Perhaps, he had suggested during one late-night research session, their homeworld was so dangerous that stopping to coo over young creatures would have resulted in immediate death. Hendricks had laughed at this suggestion. Actually laughed. "You ever see a human around a puppy?" he had asked. "We turn into complete idiots. Can't form coherent sentences, abandon all dignity, make ridiculous baby talk noises. Trust me, we're not immune to cute." This had only confused the researchers further. If humans weren't immune to finding young creatures adorable, and they clearly possessed protective instincts, what made them different from every other species in the galaxy? The answer had begun to emerge during what Dr. Brightscale would later describe as the most scientifically frustrating day of my career. She had arranged for a series of controlled exposures, bringing increasingly adorable alien offspring into the laboratory to test the limits of Hendricks's immunity. The human had performed admirably, maintaining focus and rational thought throughout encounters with Zephyrian tadpoles, Corellian fox kits, and even a juvenile Luminarian crystal singer, whose vocalizations had reduced half the research team to helpless, protective sob. But then the emergency alarms had started blaring. A cargo bay accident had trapped 3 different species of offspring behind a collapsed bulkhead, with structural damage threatening to vent the entire section to space. The research team, along with most of the station personnel, had rushed to the scene and promptly become completely useless. 47 highly trained individuals stood in the corridor, overwhelmed by protective instincts, and unable to think clearly enough to organize a rescue operation. They knew the cubs were in danger, knew something needed to be done, but their biology had essentially short-circuited their ability to take effective action. Hendricks had assessed the situation for approximately 30 seconds, then begun issuing orders. Bright scale, I need structural integrity reports on sections C7 through C12. Thornweave, get me a portable atmospheric generator and 3 emergency oxygen supplies. Duskwind, start coordinating with station security to clear evacuation. Ironjaw, find me someone who understands the ventilation system layout. The researchers had stared at him in amazement. Not because he was taking charge, emergency situations often produced unlikely leaders, but because he was doing so while 3 different species of adorable endangered offspring were crying for help just beyond the damaged bulkhead. By all rights, he should have been as mentally compromised as everyone else. Instead, he was thinking tactically, weighing options, calculating risk. He had disappeared into the damaged section with a cutting torch and emergency supplies, emerging 20 minutes later with 3 very grateful alien cubs and a solution to the structural damage that had impressed even the station's engineering staff. Brightscale had cornered him afterward, demanding an explanation. How? She had asked, still slightly breathless from her own protective anxiety attack. How were you able to think clearly when those cubs were in danger? Every other being on this station was reduced to emotional paralysis. Hendricks had considered the question seriously, perhaps for the first time realizing that his behavior was genuinely unusual. I guess, he had said slowly, when something needs protecting, the best way to protect it is to actually solve the problem rather than just worrying about it. The simplicity of this statement had sent the research team into theoretical overdrive. Could it really be that straightforward? Were humans somehow evolved to maintain cognitive function during protective episodes? And if so, what did that say about their species' history? Thornweave suspected they were about to discover something remarkable about human evolution. He also suspected that the galaxy's understanding of protective behavior was about to be completely revolutionized. What he didn't suspect was that Captain Hendricks was about to become the most in-demand being in known space. The breakthrough came, as most scientific revelations do, at 3 in the morning during Dr. Brightscale's 4th consecutive sleepless night of research. She had been reviewing footage from the cargo bay rescue when she noticed something that made her drop her stimcaf all over her datapad. In the recording, while 47 other beings stood paralyzed by protective instincts, Hendricks hadn't just maintained his cognitive function, he had actually gotten better at problem solving. His movements during the emergency had been more decisive, his voice calmer, his tactical thinking sharper than she had observed during any of their controlled laboratory sessions. It was as if the presence of endangered offspring had somehow enhanced his capabilities rather than diminishing them. This was, by every known model of protection mandate psychology, completely impossible. Dr. Brightscale had immediately contacted her colleagues, dragging them out of their sleep cycles to review the data. What they discovered challenged everything they thought they understood about protective behavior across sapient species. Look at his neural activity readings, Dr. Thornweave had whispered, pointing at the biomonitoring data they had collected during the emergency. His stress levels are elevated, but his cognitive processing speed has actually increased. His decision-making centers are more active, not less. Dr. Duskwind had pulled up comparative readings from other species during protection mandate episodes. The contrast was stark. While most beings showed decreased activity in reasoning centers and hyperactivity in emotional processing areas, Hendricks displayed the exact opposite pattern. His emotional centers remained engaged but controlled, while his analytical functions had shifted into what could only be described as enhanced operational mode. It's as if, Ironjaw had mused, studying the data with growing excitement, his species evolved to become more effective under protective stress, rather than less. This observation had launched an intensive research program into human evolutionary history. What the team discovered in Earth's archives painted a picture of a species that had developed under radically different pressures than any other known civilization. Most sapient species had evolved on worlds where the primary threats came from environmental factors, harsh climates, resource scarcity, or natural disasters. Their protective instincts had developed as a simple biological imperative. When offspring were threatened, all other considerations ceased to matter. This made sense in environments where the greatest dangers were predictable and could be addressed through vigilance and overwhelming parental dedication. Humans, however, had evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill everything on it. Earth's fossil records revealed a planet where massive predators hunted in coordinated packs, where environmental disasters occurred with stunning regularity, and where survival required not just protective instincts, but strategic thinking, tool use, and complex social coordination. A species that froze up at the first sign of danger to their young would have been extinct within a few generations. "Look at this," Dr. Brightscale had said, projecting an analysis of human prehistoric remains. Evidence of coordinated hunting of creatures 10 times their size. Tool modification for specific tasks. Social structures that required long-term planning and resource allocation. These aren't the behaviors of a species that could afford to shut down cognitive function during emergency. The data painted a picture of early humans as persistence hunters, beings who had survived not through superior strength or speed, but through sheer tactical stubbornness and the ability to outlast their prey through careful planning and coordinated effort. They had been pack hunters in the truest sense, creatures whose survival depended on their ability to work together toward long-term goals even under extreme stress. Dr. Duskwind had discovered the most revealing piece of evidence in a study of human child-rearing practice. Unlike most species, human offspring required care for an extended period, nearly 2 decades before reaching full maturity. More importantly, they required care from multiple adults working in coordination. Their young couldn't be protected by simple vigilance, she had explained to the research team. Human cubs needed active problem-solving, resource management, and strategic planning. A parent who became cognitively impaired at the first sign of danger would have been useless for actual protection. The implications were staggering. Humans hadn't failed to develop proper protective instincts. They had evolved superior protective instincts, where other species had developed biological responses that prioritized emotional intensity over practical effectiveness. Humans had developed responses that enhanced their problem-solving abilities during protective crises. Thornweave had run additional tests, exposing Hendricks to increasingly complex emergency scenarios involving alien offspring. The results confirmed their theory. The more dangerous the situation, the more strategically focused the human became. His protective instincts didn't override his rational thought. They enhanced it. "It's like watching a computer upgrade itself in real time," Dr. Ironjaw had observed during one particularly elaborate simulation. His species doesn't just want to protect cubs, they're evolutionarily programmed to become better at protecting cubs under pressure. The research team had begun to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic civilization. Every other species treated protection as an emotional response that superseded rational thought. Humans treated protection as a tactical challenge that required enhanced rational thought. But their academic celebration had been interrupted by an urgent communication from the Hegemony High Council. The message had been brief and terrifying. A catastrophic failure at the Nexus research station had resulted in a hull breach that trapped nursery pods from 7 different species in a rapidly decompressing section. The station's entire population, over 3,000 beings, had been rendered functionally useless by collective protection mandate paralysis. Emergency response teams from 4 different sectors were experiencing the same problem upon arrival. Dozens of alien cubs were going to die, and the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy were helpless to save them, because their biological programming wouldn't allow them to think clearly enough to organize an effective rescue. The High Council's message had been directed specifically to Dr. Brightscale's research team. "Send the human. Now." Captain Hendricks had received the emergency briefing with his characteristic calm efficiency, asking practical questions about station layout, available resources, and structural integrity rather than expressing the emotional devastation that such news typically produced in other species. Within 6 hours, he was aboard the fastest ship the Hegemony could provide, heading toward what would either be the galaxy's most successful rescue operation, or its most tragic confirmation that some problems couldn't be solved by good intentions alone. Brightscale had monitored the situation from Station Omega-7, watching long-range sensor readings and communications traffic with growing anxiety. This wasn't a controlled laboratory experiment, or a localized emergency. This was a test of whether their theory about human protective evolution could scale up to a genuine crisis involving multiple species, complex technical challenges, and time-critical decision-making. The fate of those cubs, and possibly the future of interspecies relations, now depended on whether one human could do what thousands of other beings could not: think clearly while everything adorable was dying. Captain Hendricks arrived at Nexus Research Station to find 3,000 of the galaxy's finest minds standing around looking helpless, while the universe's most sophisticated emergency response systems sat unused. It would have been comedic if dozens of alien cubs weren't slowly suffocating behind collapsed bulkheads. The station commander, a normally competent hegemony official named Admiral Foss, met Hendricks at the airlock with tears streaming down his face. The nursery section, he managed between protective sobs. 17 different species, hull breach in section, Delta 7. We can't think straight enough to coordinate. Hendricks surveyed the chaos with the detached efficiency that had baffled xenobiologists for months. Emergency crews stood frozen in corridors, their equipment abandoned as they stared helplessly toward the damaged sections. Medical teams clutched emergency supplies but seemed unable to remember what they were supposed to do with them. Even the station's AI systems had been overridden by well-meaning beings who kept trying to help in increasingly counterproductive ways. "How long since the breach?" Hendricks asked, already moving toward the command center. 4 hours, Admiral Foss replied, struggling to follow. "The emergency bulkheads sealed automatically, but life support in that section is failing. We estimate maybe 2 hours of breathable atmosphere remaining." The human nodded, accessing the station's engineering schematics with the calm focus of someone reviewing a shopping list. While everyone else was overwhelmed by the emotional crisis, he was already calculating pressure differentials, structural load limits, and optimal entry points. "I need 12 volunteers," he announced to the assembled crowd. "People who can follow orders without discussion and won't second-guess tactical decisions." This request produced the first moment of clarity most of the responders had experienced in hours. Following orders was something they could conceptualize, even while their protective instincts were in overdrive. Hands went up throughout the crowd. Hendricks selected his team with brutal efficiency, choosing beings based on their species' physical capabilities and technical specializations, rather than their emotional state. A hegemony engineer for structural analysis, 2 Andrexian security officers for heavy lifting, a Deltan communications specialist for coordinating between sections, others whose skills matched specific aspects of the rescue operation. What happened next would be studied in tactical academies across the galaxy for decades to come. While his volunteers struggled with protective paralysis, Hendricks transformed their biological compulsions into operational assets. He didn't fight their overwhelming need to save the cubs. He channeled it into specific, achievable tasks. "Your protective instincts are telling you those cubs need oxygen," he told the engineering team. "I need you to reroute emergency life support to section Delta 7. Your biology wants to save them. This is how you save them. You're desperate to get those cubs to safety," he informed the security officers. "I need you to clear structural debris from corridor C50. Every piece you move gets them closer to rescue." The approach was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of asking beings to overcome their protective instincts, he was giving them concrete ways to satisfy those instincts through coordinated action. Their overwhelming need to help became focused laser precision under his direction. Bright Scale, monitoring from Station Omega 7, watched in amazement as 3,000 panicked beings transformed into the most motivated rescue operation in galactic history. Hendricks had essentially turned biological compulsion into tactical advantage. The human himself had disappeared into the damaged sections with a cutting torch, emergency oxygen, and the kind of improvised engineering solutions that would have violated 17 different safety protocols under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Hendricks was operating under the enhanced cognitive state that human evolution had developed for exactly this type of crisis. His voice crackled over the communication systems as he worked his way through collapsed corridors, rerouting power conduits to maintain lighting and rescue zones. Need medical team standing by at airlock 7. Engineering. I'm seeing stress fractures in hull section Delta 12. Reinforce that bulkhead now. Each instruction was clear, specific, and designed to give overwhelmed beings something concrete to focus their protective energy on. The rescue operation began moving with mechanical precision, driven by the combined force of galactic protective instincts, under competent human coordination. 2 hours later, Hendricks emerged from the damaged sections, carrying the last of the alien cubs, a tiny Zephyrian, whose species equivalent of crying sounded like musical chime. Behind him came a parade of rescued offspring from 7 different worlds, all safe, all healthy, all completely oblivious to the fact that they had just participated in the most significant interspecies rescue in galactic history. The aftermath was even more remarkable than the rescue itself. As word spread throughout known space, every government, research institution, and commercial organization reached the same inevitable conclusion. Humans weren't just immune to protection mandate paralysis. They were the solution too. Within weeks, Captain Hendricks found himself fielding job offers from organizations he'd never heard of. The Andrexian Commerce Guild wanted to hire him as a Cub safety coordinator. The Hegemony Military offered him a commission as Director of Interspecies Emergency Response. Even the notorious Beltran Syndicate sent a remarkably polite inquiry about his availability for child-friendly logistics operations. Dr. Brightscale's research team published their findings to universal acclaim and immediate practical application. Training programs were established to help other species work more effectively, alongside human coordinators during protection mandate episodes. Entire emergency response protocols were rewritten around the assumption that at least one human would be available to maintain tactical oversight, while everyone else focused on emotional support. The irony was not lost on anyone paying attention. Humans had spent centuries being viewed as the galaxy's most dangerous species, violent, unpredictable, prone to solving problems through destructive means. Now they were being recognized as the galaxy's most essential caregivers, the only beings capable of maintaining rational thought, while everyone else was overwhelmed by protective instincts. Captain Hendricks, for his part, seemed remarkably unimpressed by his newfound fame. When asked by a Galactic Broadcasting Network reporter how it felt to be designated as the universe's premier child safety expert, he had simply shrugged and said, "Someone's got to do it." Which, Brightscale reflected while reviewing the latest batch of emergency response statistics, perfectly summarized the human approach to protection. While other species had evolved elaborate emotional responses to endangered cubs, humans had evolved the practical stubbornness to actually keep them safe. The universe had finally found its perfect babysitters. They just happened to be the same species everyone had previously been terrified of. And so Captain Hendricks returned to his freight-hauling routes, though his cargo manifests now included regular deliveries to nursery facilities, educational institutions, and emergency response stations across 17 different sectors. His ship's emergency protocols had been upgraded to handle multi-species cub rescue scenarios. His crew quarters had been modified to accommodate temporary passengers of various developmental stages and atmospheric requirements. The bad decision had become the galaxy's most reliable rescue vessel, operated by the universe's most reluctant nanny. It was, Dr. Brightscale thought, with considerable amusement, exactly the kind of cosmic joke that evolution seemed to specialize